On this episode of Africa's Big Switch, the ABS team sat down together with Rahul Srinivasan. Rahul is a senior energy specialist at Sustainable Energy for All, aka SEforAll, which is a United Nations partner organization that strives to help accelerate access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy in developing countries, particularly in Africa and Asia. SEforAll's CEO is the UN Secretary General's Special Representative for Sustainable Energy for All and is also the co-chair of the UN Energy. We hope you enjoy this.
Welcome to another ABS episode. Today, Hasana and I will be joined by Rahul Srinivasan, who will be talking to us about some of the work he does in Sustainable Energy for All. And this would be around powering healthcare centers in Africa. Rahul, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast today. I'm actually buzzing to have this conversation because I think there's a lot of insights and there's a lot of knowledge that's going to be passed on today as to what you do and the work you've done also in the past. Rahul, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Bolaji. Firstly, it's a pleasure to be on the Africa Big Switch. This is my first podcast. I'm extremely excited too. A big hello to all our listeners and viewers. So Bolaji, as you mentioned, I work at Sustainable Energy for All, which is a United Nations partner organization that collaborates with various organizations to make sure that energy access is not a barrier in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, as well as other developing countries. Energy is critical to ensure that there's human capital development, livelihoods are sustained, and essentially many applications that depend on energy can run smoothly. Now, within that ambit, I work on powering healthcare, which essentially which endeavors to make sure that electricity is not a binding constraint to providing healthcare. I've been working on this topic since the past 5 years. Before Sustainable Energy for All, I was working at the World Bank with the Lighting Africa team, as well as the broader Africa unit on electrification of health facilities, as well as sustainable delivery of cold chains to deliver vaccines during the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, pleasure to be on this show.
No, it's the pleasure is ours. And Rahul, you mentioned cold chain, and that's something I was there to dive into later on. But I guess a first question is, how did you find yourself in this nexus between energy and healthcare?
I think going back, Bolaji, so I forgot to mention that I'm originally from India. I was born and raised in Mumbai. And as a young child itself, I was really interested in the space of energy access. Whenever we lost power at our home in Mumbai, I realized how difficult it was for my mother and for our family to essentially grapple with any power cuts that happened in our neighborhood. So I was always curious why this happened and always felt that I wanted to be associated with a profession where I was able to bring power and light to people's lives. That's how my journey with electrical engineering and subsequently energy access began. I studied in the US after completing my undergraduate studies in Mumbai. I moved to the US to study electrical engineering, my master's in electrical engineering, and subsequently I studied public administration, where again I focused on the intersection of energy, engineering, and policy. I interned at the United Nations in Vienna and again focused on energy access in sub-Saharan Africa. And I felt this was a topic that needed a lot of attention, and I felt immediately attracted to the topic because I felt I could provide value, leverage my upbringing, my experiences to help solve the energy access gap in Africa. I joined the World Bank again to work on this topic, and as destiny would have it, I realized that while many sectors and many households obviously suffered from the energy access problem, healthcare was a sector where this issue was acute. And many a times, not having access to electricity in a health clinic could be standing between life and death. And that's when I took it on myself to work in teams, to support teams and projects that electrified health facilities, as well as made sure that you had electricity for refrigeration to deliver vaccines, to deploy vaccines. And I think as I have worked on this topic, I've begun to realize how important it is to electrify health facilities, because this has far-reaching implications. Firstly, maternal care, just to make sure that the mother is able to provide, to have a normal delivery, is critical to have electricity. Many times we've seen in sub-Saharan Africa, where I myself visited, that deliveries can be conducted under torchlight or under candlelight. And that's just appalling and unacceptable in the 21st century. I think every mother deserves to have a normal delivery where she doesn't feel scared or doesn't fear that there would be no electricity or light during her delivery. So again, this is something which really kind of dawned on me when I visited sub-Saharan Africa. There have also been cases again where people who were to be treated in hospitals or health facilities were not able to survive because there was no electricity that essentially powers essential equipment such as oxygen concentrators, ventilators. And this really came to the fore during the COVID-19 crisis. It was during the COVID-19 crisis that many people suddenly realized that many of the equipment that we see in health centers and hospitals need electricity. And these are life-saving equipment, such as oxygen concentrators, ventilators, as I mentioned, as well as many other equipment that can't function if you don't have electricity. I think the other thing to keep in mind is when medicines and vaccines are delivered to help patients recover from any sort of disease, leave alone COVID-19, you need these medicines and vaccines to be stored safely at appropriate temperatures. And that, again, is not possible if there's no electricity. So these are really some of the key applications of electricity in healthcare that have begun to appreciate even more because of my experience in this space while working at the World Bank and now while working at Sustainable Energy for All, as well as our partner United Nations organizations. And I guess regular visits to Africa, I've been to sub-Saharan Africa especially many a times. I've visited health clinics, I've visited health posts, I've spoken to doctors, spoken to patients, nurses, caretakers, and it's amply clear that reliable electricity is critical to save lives and also make sure that mothers can have normal deliveries and people feel secure in their communities. So it's really a culmination of all these experiences, my upbringing, my interest in electricity, my background in engineering, then my education and policy, and then really my deep experience with the World Bank and now with Sustainable Energy for All, which has included visits to sub-Saharan Africa and meetings and interactions with people who benefit from the work that we do. That has brought me into this profession, has essentially made me proud of what I do. And I really hope I can continue the work that I've been doing so that I can make an impact in the lives of people who essentially deserve, I think, in this 21st century, the various amenities that are needed for quality healthcare.
Wow, that's really great. And we can honestly hear your passion as well. And you're definitely making an impact from what I can hear already. And it's interesting that you mentioned the maternity mortality rates, because there's even a research that shows that 390 women die each year out of hundreds of thousands of women through giving birth in bad situations in Africa. But I'm glad you're bridging that gap now, and hopefully that number comes really, really down. Going on, could you give us a brief overview of your experience when you visited Africa in regards to healthcare? Maybe an example, a story. Would like to hear more about that.
Sure. Thanks, Asana. I think to put this answer into context, it's probably useful for our listeners to know a few statistics in Africa. And I think this will really paint a very grim picture, but I think it's important to mention this. Approximately 1 billion people across the world, and mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, rely on health facilities with absolutely no access to electricity or access to unreliable electricity. It's 1 billion people. That's a huge number, and again, unacceptable in the 21st century. And in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly, I would say around 15% of the health facilities have no access to power, absolutely no access to power. And in terms of absolute numbers, this translates to around 25,000 health facilities across the region with absolutely no access to electricity in health facilities, right? And then in addition to that, you have around 70,000 to 75,000 health facilities that have access to unreliable electricity, meaning you could lose power anytime. There is no certainty. So imagine as a mother, I go to a clinic and suddenly there is no power. It can be very, very stressful. And the same thing for folks who are looking at medicines and vaccines to save their lives. Now, the reason I bring this issue up is the whole unreliable electricity part is largely because there's not much of a focus on sustainable operations. There's not much focus on operations and maintenance. So you essentially install the solar panels to provide electricity, but then there's not much effort or focus to make sure that the lights are on. And this is a huge issue. I remember once going to Southern Africa, to one of our client countries in Southern Africa, and it was a bright sunny day. It was a beautiful bright sunny day, and I saw solar panels outside the health facility. And I entered the health facility, and all I found was darkness, and I didn't see any patient. There was no patient. And I found this really baffling. And when I investigated the matter and spoke to some of the administrators at the hospital, I was informed that the solar panels were not working. Neither were the inverters that support the delivery of electricity. They had lodged a complaint to the respective line ministries to get these repaired, and they hadn't heard anything for, I believe, a couple of weeks. And this was a really sad story because it's usually not covered in the press. Usually when you install something or you inaugurate something, it gets a lot of attention, right? But the upkeep of that equipment or the hard work that it takes to make sure that whatever you've inaugurated is sustainable, is working, is maintained, this is often not covered in the press. It's not something that is known to many people. And I think that's really sad because you want to make sure that whatever investments that are being made, whatever efforts that are being put are seeing the light of the day, right? Are essentially being helpful or useful. And there's no point just buying equipment or doing something just to essentially, get publicity or just for the sake of it. You want to make sure that it's useful, it's effective. And that is a huge challenge we see in sub-Saharan Africa today. So yes, on one hand, I spoke about the huge energy access deficit, and to make sure that we bridge that deficit, you need to make investments, you need to take initiatives. But I think equally important is the operations and maintenance part. It's equally important to make sure that the investments that you've made, the initiatives that you've launched are sustainable and are effective in their functionality. So that is another key challenge I've observed while I have traveled to sub-Saharan Africa, that not only there is a huge energy access deficit, but even when interventions are made to bridge that deficit, those do not necessarily focus a lot on sustainability.
From your perspective, or from what you think it is, what do you think the reason is that these investments are not making it to the news?
Yes, I mean, there are a lot of challenges here. I mean, I'll just speak about a few, and I think you touch on an important issue. You're focused on. You've essentially asked why is it that these investments are not sustainable and why operations and maintenance is not given enough attention. I think firstly, what we need to realize is that when you're electrifying health facilities, there are a lot of partners that need to coordinate. right? Because we're talking about stakeholders from energy, we're talking about stakeholders from health. And if you look at solarizing health facilities, that also has climate benefits. So there is also this whole dimension of climate benefits and preserving the environment. Many times what we've seen is that stakeholders don't necessarily talk to each other. And this could be at the government level, could be at the level of donors, could be at the level of partners. And a lot of donors provide funding to health clinics in sub-Saharan Africa to install solar panels and essentially make sure that there is electricity that is beneficial. But these donors also sometimes have different teams. One might be looking at health donations, the other one might be looking at energy donations. Similarly, at the government level, you have the energy ministry and then you have the health ministry. Now, if they don't talk to each other and if they're not very coordinated, then we're not going to essentially have a good collaborative investment. And what does this mean? If I'm from the health ministry and I essentially deploy many equipment without understanding how they're going to be electrified, then those equipment are essentially white elephants, right? They're not going to be electrified. Similarly, if I try to electrify a health facility without knowing what I'm trying to electrify, what are the equipment, how much electricity is needed, how much buffer is needed, then I'm not going to do a good job in electrifying that health facility. So the energy and health teams need to talk to each other. The other thing that we've often seen, and this is again from one of my visits to Western Africa in this case, where one particular health facility received donations in the form of solar panels from 3 different donors over a span of, I think, 7 years. So what this means is once they got the first donation, obviously the solar panels then stopped working. That this health facility did not think about operations and maintenance. It was easier for them to just get another donation in the form of solar panels after 2 years, and then they kept on doing it. They did it thrice. The 3 donors, thankfully, were not the same donor. They were different donors, but even then, they were not coordinated. Now, this was one country, one particular region. There should be a mechanism for donors working in that region or country to also be coordinated and exchange notes so that they're not duplicating efforts, which are obviously not effective. So again, no coordination between different donors. And even within the same donor, as I mentioned, there could be different arms working on different topics, and they may not necessarily consult each other. So this coordination and working together might not sound too difficult, but I think is super, super important and not done very effectively because of bureaucracy and sometimes just not having the vision or to understand units or different sectors don't work in silos. They essentially work with each other to be successful. So I think that is one huge issue. The second key issue I would like to highlight is the financing part, and I think this should be no surprise to anyone. Per a recent report that Sustainable Energy for All actually helped publish in collaboration with the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and a few other organizations, we anticipate that around $5 billion is needed across developing countries, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa, to sustainably and reliably electrify health institutions. $5 billion. And obviously, it's a huge gap, and financing is extremely important, not only to provide solar panels, but also, again, to make sure that there is operations and maintenance. And what you will see is that many times the budgets that we see with the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Energy, will not have any line item or allocation for operations and maintenance. You might have a line item to procure solar panels or even diesel gen sets, which are polluting and not good for the environment, but you may not necessarily have a line item for operating and maintaining solar panels. That's a huge deficiency. And sometimes we see that even if there is financing, I mentioned financing is a huge gap. So sometimes there's no financing. And even if there is financing, because you don't have a line item for operations and maintenance, it gets neglected. Or you'll have that financing diverted to some other activity. So the whole discipline of raising funding and then using that funding to operate and maintain what already exists, I think is missing. And this discipline is what needs to be inculcated so that there is accountability for operating and maintaining what you install. And I think the third key barrier I would mention for your question regarding operations and maintenance is just the mindset. And as funny and as naive as this may sound, if you change the mindset, it's going to definitely lead to positive results. And when I say mindset, what does that mean? I think I alluded to this a little earlier. The mindset for donors, development partners, and even the common man / woman is often that you procure assets, you install solar panels, you can see them, but you never think about whether they're working. The optics is such that you're always thinking about procuring and buying something or cutting the red ribbon, but you're not necessarily thinking about whether they're working. And as I mentioned, when I visited one of our countries, I was so surprised that everything looked normal from the outside, but the moment you go inside, you realize that those systems are not working. We have to change that mindset to one of service delivery. So it's not just sufficient or important to install solar assets and cut the red ribbon or inaugurate something, but the focus should be on delivery of service. Only if I receive electricity as a service can I then be assured that the chances of me getting quality healthcare are going to be reasonable, or at least that energy is not going to be the barrier or impediment towards securing quality healthcare. So as a mother, if I need to do a delivery in the night, I can safely go to the hospital in the night. I would feel safe that I'm going to a place where there'll be light, where there will be equipment that are needed, obviously, for childbirth that can be electrified or powered, and I can have a safe delivery. So I think that once the thinking or mindset changes to that of electricity service rather than just procurement and buying / installing assets, that could lead to a paradigm shift in how we look at quality healthcare in sub-Saharan Africa.
That's really interesting, and I like how you ended with the mindset point. So going from a procurement mindset to a service delivery, what is the value and what am I trying to achieve? And then working backwards, that helps to solve some of the other problems the other challenges that you mentioned on funding and coordination. So the question now is, how can we shift this mindset, or what is the way forward? What are some of the solutions that you think would help close this gap? I mean, $5 billion, it might sound like a lot of money, but when you think about the money in the world, it's not that much, in my opinion. How can we close this gap?
Thanks, Bolaji. I mean, it's a good point you raised. $5 billion sounds a lot, but actually it's not that much. I'm sure if the top 2-3 CEOs of the world, of the top companies, came together and started donating some proceedings or making some funding available, you could essentially make sure that money is available. So I don't think money is necessarily the only barrier. Of course, it is not happening, which tells you that more effort is needed to mobilize financing, but you're spot on. It's not the only issue here. You've got to make sure that even if the financing is available, it's being used in the right manner, or it's being absorbed in the right manner. There needs to be a method to the madness, as I might put it. Now, while I was at the World Bank, and as I mentioned, now that I'm with Sustainable Energy for All, this has been a keen area of work for us. This is something that we've been trying to do, not only from an organizational standpoint, but also working with partner organizations such as WHO, I mentioned UNICEF, the Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, UNDP, the Clinton Health Access Initiative. There are a lot of partners that are working on this topic and in collaboration. Now, what are some of the key things that we're looking at to bridge this gap, as you mentioned? And I can talk from the perspective of Sustainable Energy for All, and then also talk a bit broadly in regards to what the sector is doing. Now, firstly, I think there are a few pillars on which you want to essentially base your response, right? You want to make sure that the funding that is needed is not only delivered, but is able to achieve the goals of service delivery that I mentioned. So the key pillars I would highlight are really data, innovation, advocacy, financing, and technical assistance. So 5 key pillars: data, innovation, advocacy, financing, and technical assistance. And what do these really mean? Let's get to the data part. Now, I essentially gave you a few numbers. I mentioned 1 billion people do not have access to electricity or rely on unreliable electricity for healthcare services. I also mentioned a few other figures, especially the $5 billion gap in essentially making sure that electricity can be delivered to health facilities. Now, it's important to essentially harness this data. Firstly, we need to get these numbers, because unless you don't have these numbers, you don't know what the gap is and what you're even trying to address. Similarly, if you go more granularly, you need to know in a particular country how many health facilities are present, how many have access to electricity, how many don't have access to electricity, and then more importantly, what sort of health services are provided, what sort of equipment is needed. So you would call this an energy audit in a more technical way, because only when you know that, you will again be able to understand and address the issues in that particular health facility. Now, this is easier said than done, because a lot of the health facilities are located in remote areas, in last mile areas where it's difficult to get data from. So you really then need to look at sophisticated mechanisms. A lot of mapping is happening these days, geospatial mapping, which essentially helps you get a bird's eye view of even villages in sub-Saharan Africa, and again using sophisticated techniques to get a sense of where the gaps exist and what needs to be done. So I think data harnessing this data, gathering it first and then harnessing it is extremely important to make sure that we understand what is it that we're trying to solve. So that's number one. Number two, advocacy. I think advocacy cannot be underrated. It's always important. I mentioned the need to change the mindsets, and that happens through advocacy, through creating awareness. So what we're doing at Sustainable Energy for All is, in fact, we have an event coming up on the margins of the World Health Assembly in May, where we want to bring in different donors and try to understand what are their priorities, what is their vision, and try to ingrain in them the importance of providing funding to match service delivery. So not just provide funding for procurement or installation of solar equipment, but essentially provide funding to make sure that service is delivered. So what this might mean is that I don't just disperse all my funding in one go to buy the equipment, but I provide funding to the health institution over, say, 5 to 10 years, over a period of time, to make sure that as a donor, I'm able to be there for the health institution over a period of time, and not just in a one go case where I'm just providing money to procure solar panels. So advocacy and awareness is very important in different segments, including the donors, to push this point that sustainability is at the core, or should be at the core, of any interventions that we take forward in terms of electrifying health facilities. So that's the importance of advocacy. And I mentioned how SEforAll is playing an active role, working with various partners to make sure that this point is clearly understood. So that's the role of advocacy, amongst many other things. And then I speak about innovation, which is, I think, very, very important in today's world, to make sure that we have access to different types of technologies. So we have off-grid technologies, we have mini-grid technologies. So a menu of options that can be used depending on the needs of the community and depending on the energy audits that are conducted. Also, technology is imperative to reduce costs. We've seen how the cost of solar panels as well as batteries has dramatically reduced over a period of time. And a lot of that is to do with innovation. Even with batteries, we're now looking more at lithium-ion batteries rather than lead-acid batteries, which were used previously. Lithium-ion batteries have a longer lifetime, which again makes operations more sustainable. So any sort of innovation / technological development that can cut down costs, that can make energy access a reality, is definitely something to be taken note of. And I think innovation doesn't only need to happen on the technology side. I think a lot can happen even on the business / financial side. If there are any innovative financial instruments that can be used to reduce cost, to provide some sort of cushion to say private sector investors who want to work in this space. That would be welcome. So looking at, for instance, risk mitigation instruments. So if the private sector does engage in electrification of health facilities, but is scared or fearful that they will not be paid for their services by the government, then I think there's a role for de-risking instruments from organizations such as the World Bank, as well as various other partners that are involved in providing de-risking instruments as an innovative way to cushion the private sector and essentially incentivize their participation. So I think there's a lot of scope for innovation again to make sure that there is an investment from the private sector. Because let me put it very clearly, when we're talking about this financing gap, this or just in general making sure that there are sustainable operations, we need the private and public sector to work in tandem. The private sector obviously brings financing, they bring a lot of experience, they bring competence, and I think that is something that is needed not only for this sector but for various sectors to make sure that there is growth and sustainability. So I spoke about data, I spoke about advocacy, I spoke about innovation. The fourth one, as I mentioned, is financing. Easier said than done, but again, if we can find ways to bring in money into the sector, do it in a streamlined manner, I think that would be great. SEforAll itself, while we work more at an upstream/midstream level, and really our work relates mostly to help partners, to enable other partners to do their best and to essentially be equipped with all the tools and support they need to electrify health facilities. But we ourselves are now working in, say, Sierra Leone, where we've provided grants to electrify 6 hospitals in the country. And then we're also developing a sustainable operations and maintenance plan to make sure that our grants can be used in an effective manner. So that's what we have done on the financing part. But as I mentioned, for the major part, we don't get into financing investments, but we enable them, or we help enable them by providing tools and advisory support to other partners that are capable or are better positioned to provide more financing. So we're more of an enabler in this regard. And the fifth pillar, as I mentioned earlier, I believe, is providing support to governments. So technical assistance, capacity building, advisory support to client governments as well as other partners. And what this means is, if there is money on the table, if there is money from any particular organization or donor, we can come in to help governments understand how they can make best use of that money to sustainably electrify health facilities. And I'll give you an example for this. One of the lasting deliverables or impacts of Sustainable Energy for All's work is roadmaps, market intelligence roadmaps and investment cases that we've developed, say, for Nigeria and Sierra Leone, and we're now developing for Rwanda and Madagascar. What this does is, for the particular country, for the country that we're working in, we try to establish the lay of the land in terms of what is the current situation with electrification of health facilities in the country, what's the demand, what's the supply like, what's the role of the private sector, where do things stand, what are the donors doing in this country, what's the status quo, what are some of the challenges, what are some of the priorities, and how does this fit well in the government's national electrification plan or national electrification strategy. So we provide this sort of market intelligence, and then based on that market intelligence, as well as our deep understanding of the sector related to electrification of health facilities, we prepare a roadmap of proposed interventions that the government and its partners can undertake to electrify health facilities. And these roadmaps and investment cases can be useful for various partners such as the World Bank, UNICEF, WHO, African Development Bank. These partners can benefit from these roadmaps and investment cases that we prepare. So as I mentioned, these are the tools that we prepare. This is the advisory support that we can provide to enable or unlock investments both from the private sector as well as the public sector to electrify health facilities. So these are some of the solutions built around the 5 pillars that I mentioned that Sustainable Energy for All is working on and is advancing. along with other partners across the globe, including World Bank, WHO, UNICEF, UNDP, Clinton Health Access Initiative. So it's really a nice group of partners with which we work, and we continue to be active. The other thing that I would mention is Sustainable Energy for All, in its role as an advocate for this important issue, is highly active and visible on international forums such as the World Health Assembly, the Conference of Parties, or COP as we would call it, which is the biggest climate summit that takes place every year, as well as various other forums. So where we can have our voice heard, we can talk to different partners and contribute to the agenda.
Wow, that sounds like a whole lot of things. You're a very busy man, Rahul. To be fair, it sounds very hopeful as well. And I think my next question would be, you mentioned roadmap. So looking at the road ahead, what should we be hopeful for in the future? What does the future look like in terms of energy and healthcare? What is currently going on, and what do you think would happen in the next, 7 years to SDG 7 or to the SDGs?
It's a great question. So firstly, Bolaji and Hassan, I'm an optimist. I really am an optimist. I always run on hope. I'm fueled by hope. And I truly believe the goal for 2030 should be that every health facility in sub-Saharan Africa and developing countries should have access to electricity. I think it's unacceptable, as I mentioned, that we still have health facilities with zero access to electricity. So that should be goal one, that every health facility in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and other developing countries / regions should have access to electricity. And that would be a significant accomplishment, not only for SDG 7, which relates to energy, but SDG 3, which relates to health. SDG 3 and SDG 7 are very interconnected. You cannot achieve SDG 3, which is related to well-being and health, without achieving SDG 7. So I think there's a lot of incentives for folks who work at the intersection and nexus of energy and health to ensure that SDG 7 is being advanced to meet SDG 3. I think the second thing that I would want to highlight is how this must obviously be done in an environmentally friendly manner. We want to make sure that we're using renewable energy technologies such as solar to bridge this gap. A lot of institutions, and there's a lot of health institutions, even schools in sub-Saharan Africa use diesel. Now, diesel has so many issues, right? We all know it's polluting, it's environmentally unfriendly. It's also expensive to operate because the cost of diesel can be very volatile depending on external circumstances such as the Ukraine-Russia war right now, for that matter. And then if you are in islands, again, to procure that diesel from another country can be extremely expensive. So this is volatile cost, unpredictable cost, and can really sink the budgetary capacity of health institutions to pay. So we must try to get out of this diesel trap because I think it obviously comes in the way of climate goals, SDG 13, or even looking at our Paris goals from 2015. So I think, yes, we want every health facility to be electrified, but we also want to make sure that we're doing this as much as possible, keeping in mind climate benefits. So we do it in a responsible manner, in a climate-friendly manner. And I think the third part really is the sustainability angle that I mentioned. Once we electrify these health facilities in a climate-friendly manner, I do hope every organization, every health facility, donors, development partners are able to appreciate the importance of targeting their interventions in a sustainable manner. So whatever funding is provided, whatever efforts are put forth, we make sure that we're keeping the end goal in mind. Because remember, solar panels and batteries can last for more than 7 to 8 years. So we want to make sure that once these are installed, then they're not replaced until their lifetime ends, right? For batteries, that's 8 to 10 years. For solar panels, around 15 years. We want them to function. And obviously, you need to make sure that they're looked after, just like anything in the world. They're looked after. There is preventive maintenance. There is reactive maintenance. And really there's this culture and discipline to maintain systems, operate and maintain systems that are procured. So I think that's the third thing I would mention. And a key part of making sure that systems are sustainable and there is a focus on operations and maintenance is to make sure that there's money. There's money in your budget. There are line items that are devoted to operations and maintenance, because if you have that, then you obviously have an incentive to use that money to make sure that the systems that you've procured are healthy. If you don't have those budget lines, then you're obviously not going to be incentivized to spend money on operations and maintenance, and that's why it'll get overlooked, like it did during that visit that I spoke about. It had been 2 weeks that a complaint had been lodged to the line ministry, but there was really no response because I guess there was no budget, and since there was no budget line related to O&M, it didn't receive the traction that it deserved. So those are really the three key things I feel we should accomplish by 2030. So I'll repeat just for everyone's reference. I think number one, you obviously want to make sure that every health facility has access to electricity. I think number two, we do that in a climate friendly and sustainable manner. And number three, we make sure that there's financing, budget, intent to pay for operations and maintenance and sustainability.
I've really been absorbing everything you've been saying. Your insights are very powerful. Thank you. And I'm also aware that you were a teaching fellow in Harvard as well when you were doing your master's as well. And on that note, I want to ask, what life teachings, should I say, have you discovered that you believe our listeners will really benefit from? And following on that, are there any call to actions, campaigns that you would like to push, or SEforAll, are they hiring?
Thank you, Hasna. Thank you for bringing out that aspect of my professional journey. Yes, I was a teaching fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School where I studied. I pursued my master's in public administration at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I think teaching was a joy, has always been a joy. I view it as a great platform to share my ideas and also learn from students and others who have interesting perspectives. Now, when I taught, I think one thing that I really appreciated is I was teaching students from approximately 40 to 50 countries. So there were a lot of diverse perspectives, and every country is different. Every country has a different situation, has a different trajectory, has a different priority, especially with regards to energy, electrification, health, education. And I think absorbing those different perspectives really made me more well-rounded as a teacher as well as a listener. So even today, when I try to learn something, I try to absorb different perspectives when I read something or when I talk to someone. I will try to make sure that I'm making informed decisions or essentially not being biased by just one particular perspective. I think the beauty of working with people from different countries and different backgrounds and diversities is that you can really absorb everything and then make an informed decision. So that is something I really learned at Harvard, and I would like to advise the listeners here. Whether you're a student or a professional, you could be a man, a woman, you could be young, you could be old. I think there's a lot of merit in learning from diverse perspectives. We shouldn't discount any perspective because it's coming from a certain space that you may not appreciate. I think there's a lot of benefit in diversity, and I would really encourage you to read different articles, different books, listen to people with divergent views sometimes, whether it's on a political spectrum or whether it's on a professional spectrum, so that you know what exists, because sometimes we don't know what exists or we don't know what we don't know. And I think that should not be the case. You should take a keen interest in learning from different perspectives and then shaping your opinion or shaping your decision. So I think that would be something I would like to share with the listeners based on my experience as a teacher and a student at Harvard. In terms of some key messages, calls to action, recruiting, well, I think Sustainable Energy for All is extremely active on social media. You should definitely follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I believe we are on TikTok too. We have a very active social media team. We are constantly recruiting. In fact, We're currently recruiting for someone to help us with advocacy and communications. We've shortlisted candidates and we're in the process of interviewing. We hope to complete that in the next 2-3 weeks. But not only my team, there are other teams as well that are constantly looking for bright talent from across the world. I think, as I mentioned, we are an international organization. We are a United Nations partner organization. We respect diversity on every count and from every perspective. So we encourage people to apply on the website, showcase their skills, and we would be happy to review those applications and take it from there. And I think through our social media channels, you will also be able to understand a little bit more as to what Sustainable Energy for All does, all the knowledge products, tools, advisory support that we provide to governments and partners are usually summarized and articulated really well through our social media accounts. We really pay attention to that because we realize that social media is a great way to connect with the common man/woman, young people, professionals who want to work in the energy sector and the health sector. So we really take it as a responsibility and are very proud of our social media presence and really want to connect with people. And if you ever have any questions, there is a way to respond to those posts, and we would again be happy to clarify anything. We have a website as well where you can post questions. There is an email address that you can write to. So I guess in brief, whatever we do will be communicated and articulated well on social media, and we encourage you to follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, and even our website.
That was really great to hear. And we'll definitely be linking those social medias in the description as well. And I really love SEforAll staying connected through social media, especially when you mentioned TikTok, because I don't see too many organizations getting involved in that space, because at the end of the day, people forget that you can educate through entertainment. So I'm really glad to hear that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think Sustainable Energy for All has a very open mind, and as I mentioned, benefits from diverse perspectives. It's something that I really admire about the organization. And we've realized that different social media appeal to different audiences, and we want to capture all of them. And most importantly, we want to appeal to the youth of this world, which really is the future and will drive positive change moving forward.
100%. Thank you so much for that. So we usually have a bonus question that we ask all our speakers if you've heard back on previous episodes. Hopefully, this should be an exciting one. So if you were to travel anywhere in Africa, let's say one of the listeners says, "Oh, Rahul, I listened to you on Africa's Big Switch. I would like to pay for your expenses to anywhere in Africa. Where would that be, and why would you choose that place?"
Sorry, where would I travel?
Yeah, on an all expense paid trip to Africa, where would you travel and why?
Great question. I think I have two answers to this. So firstly, I have traveled to quite a few African countries, and my personal favorite is Kenya. I would go to Kenya anytime, doesn't matter when. I would love to travel to Kenya. I think it's a magical country, and one of the reasons is I feel very close to nature. The wildlife there, the greenery. Sometimes Nairobi or the country in general feels like a sanctuary because you have animals very close to the city center. So that is something which I think is very unique to that region and to that country, and really makes you feel like you're one with nature. So Nairobi is one of my favorite cities in Africa, and Kenya, is a beautiful country. I find it very magical, and even though I've visited it many times, I will never say no to an opportunity to visit Kenya. So that would be one answer. And I think the second answer, I would like to think of a country that I have not visited, but would like to visit because it excites me, or I feel there is something different about it. Now I'm just trying to think, because as I mentioned, I have traveled quite extensively in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa generally. I think Egypt could be a nice country because of its rich civilization and very old civilization. I think I'm a huge fan of history. I really enjoy history. I enjoy culture, and Egypt could be a very interesting place to explore from that standpoint. So, of course, that's more Northern Africa, but I think in Sub-Saharan Africa, a country that has often mesmerized me and I found interesting is the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's one of the richest countries in terms of minerals. It's a huge country in Sub-Saharan Africa. It has a lot of potential, and I've never worked there. I've never visited DRC, but I just feel it could be an interesting place to visit and learn a lot.
Yes, DRC is also one of the countries I would like to go to, and I agree with your point. It just has so much potential, and there's just a lot of value that can come out of there. And I think the people will be like cool as well, and the food will be nice, which is a big factor. But honestly, Rahul, thank you for speaking to us today. I think this has been a really, really insightful conversation. I've learned a lot about healthcare and about some of the work you've done in SEforAll. And I think that your call to action is actually quite relevant. We need to all play our different small parts, but together could have a big impact to helping solve some of the challenges we have in our society. So again, on behalf of me and Hasana, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bulaji. Thank you, Hasana. And again, thank you to the Africa Big Switch for inviting me to participate in this podcast. I was a little nervous given that this was my first podcast, but I think I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I really hope that the listeners find it as exciting as it has been for us.
I'm sure they will. Thank you.